Good afternoon, basic people. Welcome to the People's Basics. Today is Wednesday, April 28th. And today on the program, we're going to be doing a video breaking down a word you might know a lot if you are an activist online, especially within more progressive circles, and that is neoliberalism. There is a lot of usage of this word now as just simply kind of a slur for some progressives to use whenever someone is disagreeing and potentially is taking an approach that somewhat agrees to capitalism. So I wanted to really break it down with our audience today. What does this word really mean? What is it encompassing within this ideology of neoliberalism? And how did it become so prominent in today's society? And so I want to remind you all to please help us grow the movement for the People's Basics. Please, we're having a sub goal where we are trying to reach 2,000 subs right now on our YouTube. So please make sure if you're not doing it already, please hit the subscribe button so that you're alerted when any of our content will come out on YouTube. We're really going to be doing pushes periodically to hit new targets, and we're going to be having rewards each time that we do it. So for 2000, we're going to be looking to make a little fun fan content. I'll be doing a little karaoke for you all because of that. That's what I've pledged to someone in the past when we hit 2000. So please hit that subscribe button so that we can hit our goals and grow this movement. And you will not regret it because, oh boy, it's either going to be fun for you all to hear me sing or it's going to be miserable. One way or another, there will be laughs for sure. But that being said, let's get into today's topic. So, neoliberalism. What does it mean? So there are some key aspects that define neoliberalism, and those aspects are as such. One, neoliberalism believes in the idea of privatization. Privatization meaning that we have existing services that the government has responsibility over, that they are looking to have sold off to, companies to be able to administer themselves, whether that be licenses or directly selling off assets to organizations. That is commonly, done in many different areas because the government does a lot of different things. And so it doesn't necessarily mean any individual things. It's just a general notion of the free market is generally better at doing a lot of things, and that the government is kind of seen a little bit more as an overseer rather than an administrator of service. The next thing is that they believe staunchly in the notion of deregulation. Now, obviously, they actually have some forms of regulation within the capital markets that they do believe in, but largely they are wanting to gut any forms of regulation on businesses that they can. It's a general philosophy, and I will say, here's the thing as well: you're going to have a lot of things within an ideology that might have variance. And so certain people might have different determinations of what is acceptable deregulation and what is not. The third key aspect to neoliberalism is a strong embrace of globalization, whether that be outsourcing, whether that be having large forms of diplomacy, whether that be in how we do our foreign policy and being more interventionary. They believe that we have to have a staunch role as an active participant in the global community. The next thing that they believe in, kind of similar in nature, is that they believe in free trade, kind of similar to deregulation, kind of similar to the globalization. Free trade is that embodiment that they believe brings the most efficiency to the market and therefore is the best for each individual society. We've talked about this in the past about how there are some complications around the issue that doesn't make it as pure cut as any form of free trade is good. We have to be making sure that there are certain standards that are still being withheld so that we're not just simply having a race to the bottom in terms of how we treat labor, in terms of capital being able to move much more easily across borders than labor does. So we need to make sure that capital is not just making all the labor sources of different countries compete against one another and who can provide the least for their workers. And then, another aspect to neoliberalism is the notion of austerity. So, in general, neoliberals are not as big fans of having taxation that is at a higher level and funding a larger, more robust welfare state. They would prefer having a system where they are providing very little benefits and having very little taxation. And then you might be asking yourself, like, what is really the distinction between neoliberalism and some aspects of, conservatism? Because a lot of these things kind of come in common. And that would be kind of like the cultural aspect of things. Cultural liberalism is that last defining aspect of neoliberalism. And so what does, cultural liberalism really entail? It's really the freedom of individuals from, cultural norm. Like, to quote, like it's marching to the beat of a different drummer, essentially. And so, some of the key things that they believe in that kind of establishes this individuality as well as this kind of working relationship together, is they believe in democracy. They believe in trying to achieve some level of gender equality, some level of racial equality. As we mentioned before, they embrace largely internationalism. It's kind of a sense of egalitarianism, of taking from different ideas and valuing other cultures. And then finally, it's a freedom of expression. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. You can make qualms about whether these things actually achieve those goals, but those are the things that are at least entailed in the value set of liberalism. So, how did this idea generally get started? Well, it was first being used in the it was not early 20th century. It was late, like, 19th century. There was this French economist, Charles Guide, who basically, in his, like, manifesto, what was it called? Maffeo. Let me look it up. Maffeo Pantaleone. That's what it was called. He used the term neoliberalism, which was, a previously existing word in French, but he started to kind of define it as an ideology. It started to grow in more popularity as some more mainstream economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek started to embrace the policy, which was kind of a large reaction to a trend that was happening within, like, the 1920s and 1930s about an increased level of government oversight to try and control markets that were, essentially exerting negative volatility or externalities on the public. And so, this started to kind of catch on a little bit more in, like, the United States in the 70s. And so basically, there had been this large embrace up until the 70s of Keynesian economics, basically the notion that stimulus is going to be basically nearly always good for the economy in a sense. This had led to some trends during the 1970s around stagflation, which is basically just a very high degree of inflation. And we were also facing an energy crisis at the time. And so there had been some calls from within kind of like the business community to try and do some pushback on some of the general, you know, their opinions of misguided criticisms of the free market enterprise. And so the main piece of the time that kind of kickstarted this movement was a piece by Lewis Powell, done in 1971, where it was like a conferential memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce, where he was basically laying out how there was this need for the establishment of more, frankly, think tanks to be able to combat this ideology of criticism of laissez-faire capitalism. Ironically, it was actually still under the Jimmy Carter administration where some of these policies started to take hold. Jimmy Carter was pretty big in terms of deregulation of a couple key industries like trucking, banking, the airline industry. So he is not a blameless individual. And you'll notice this throughout this kind of evolution of neoliberalism taking a foothold in America, that it largely had been kind of both parties that embraced core aspects of this. But we had a massive acceleration under Ronald Reagan. And frankly, this was paired with overseas, even in the UK, he kind of had this strong relationship with Margaret Thatcher, who was doing very similar things in the UK. And so when it came to what the things that the Reagan administration was going, and we could do whole long, lengthy videos on all the dangerous things that Ronald Reagan did during his administration. But some of the things that kind of define neoliberalism that he had done is he passed the largest tax cut in history of America. He did more financial deregulations, and that they basically felt that this was all due to their opinion, not globalization, but the general notion that we were overregulating the economy and that unions were too strong in America. And so this kind of continued to fester through the W. Bush administration into, frankly, I would say Bill Clinton is one of the worst offenders when it comes to the notion of neoliberalism. It comes with things like NAFTA. It comes with things like, deregulating the financial sector even more with the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Comes with deregulating it as well with, repealing Glass-Steagall. It comes from doing cuts to welfare through the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. So this has been really kind of like a growing bipartisan consensus since largely the 1970s, and the only real distinction between like neoliberalism and neoconservatism has been largely some of the cultural policies that we kind of talked about in liberalism before, whether people are willing to embrace racial equality and gender equality or not. That's largely been the biggest distinction between those two kind of factions that have largely very similar economic policy and even foreign policy. So, the term even became more widely popularized now, like globally, also in the 1980s, because it wasn't just, the European nations in America. We were also having this kind of foothold of a movement take place now in Latin America, too. Specifically in like a country like Chile, you had Augusto Pinochet, who really was like one of the famous people to implement these things on a wide scale. And he was able to do so much of it because he essentially was just a military dictator of Chile at the time. Now, mind you, when he came into power, Chile's economy was in a very deep depression for several reasons. Like, the Allende's government had basically expressed that many Chilean and foreign businesses, including like copper mines, had to have controlled prices, and inflation was basically reaching points like over 600%. Income per capita was in decline, roughly like 7% in total at the time. And, overall, they were having a major contraction in GDP of around 5%. So there were some factors coming into play where people really were looking for a radical shift of things. Now, mind you, it didn't exactly pan out, and that there were some short-term macroeconomic factors that did improve things in the short term, but long term, it did not exactly help out much in terms of the results from Pinochet. Um, you know, Largely one of the reasons why he basically came into power is he wanted to essentially turn the nation from a nation of proletariats into a nation of proprietors, because so many people were getting used to this notion of just, being part of the working class struggle, that they weren't actually achieving the non-struggle. And so we wanted to try and empower people into becoming more independent for themselves. And so he said, basically at the time, that they were going to be looking some, general cuts and some general sell-offs of certain areas. So one of the big privatization efforts that was being done was Chile's copper supply. Uh, Basically, in 1976, Codelco was established to exploit them, but like new mineral deposits were then opened up to private investment. Um, in the November 1980, the pension system was restructured from like a PAYGO system to a fully funded capitalization system run by private sector pension funds. Healthcare and education were also being privatized in the nation. And, these mines would ultimately help them economically. However, they would fall partly into American hands. So this has been something that we've kind of been a major influence in spreading out to Latin America, because it allowed us to be able to have more interest in some of the resources of these other nations. After like some factors that kind of came into play as results, wages under Pinochet decreased by 8%. Family allowances were basically 28% of what they were before he had come into power. And the budgets for education, health, and housing had dropped by over 20% on average. Uh, you know, After Pinochet was in power, 45% of people were in poverty in Chile, and the wealth of the top 10% had, grown by 83% at the time, which, could partially be some of the culmination of why some of the protests in 2019 around economic inequality arised. It's because of this system that had been set in place for decades, established by Pinochet. According to even a 2020 study in the Journal of Economic History, Pinochet sold, his firms largely at below market prices to politically connected buyers. So, like, largely, this is another effort of actually corruption being able to play out when you start embracing these notions of privatization. You start selling off the assets to your just buddies for potentially some kickbacks as well. So, this is really how neoliberalism has grown into the American consensus. Now, I don't think that it should be used as a necessarily derogatory term as broadly as it's used today by the left. I think it needs to be understood very clearly, what does the actual terminology stand for, and then we can oppose it on those fronts. But the term can't become so opaque that we don't even understand what we're saying. We just sound like we're just mad and angry that people can possibly hold different opinions with us. We can hold firm critiques of the downsides of what neoliberalism are without us having to basically use it as a catch-all of saying, oh, you're just some shill for the Democratic Party. Because that's not what it exactly means. And not every Democrat who even is not aligned with us on every single one of our big priorities is a neoliberal. So we should actually treat words with serious meaning and use them appropriately. And so that's why we made today's video. We wanted to educate you on what does this term really mean and what was its history that kind of led up to its growth internationally. Some other names that we didn't get to mention through that kind of breakdown of it that are prominent neoliberals for you all to go look up if you are so inclined is you can look at people like James Buchanan. You can look up people like uh, arguably Milton Friedman, though he kind of borders on being more neoconservative than neoliberal. But a lot of neoliberal sources will cite him because he has done work specifically referencing neoliberalism. You could make cases for Al Gore. You can make cases for like Alan Greenspan as neoliberals that are like very prominent within kind of like the philosophy of how it's built. And like, namely, also you can look up Charles Peters, who's another form like that. So that's really what we wanted to do today is let you know what neoliberalism was so that you all can understand how to intelligently use it within your conversations and so that we can kind of start to actually define ourselves well and understand what our opponents are rather than trying to define them with words that aren't actually accurate indicators of what they believe. So that being said, my friends, I want to hear what you think about neoliberalism. Do you think that inherently it is the main ideology that needs to be opposed? Are you a supporter of it? We want to hear your thoughts there. And then also, please let us know, what topics do you want us to cover in the future? Whenever we're not doing our videos, interviewing you members of our community on our Commoners Corner, we are looking to continue to be able to do education around the basics and give some more general political education to you all. So we want to hear what you all are thinking about that you want to see covered in the future. I am going to be checking all of our comments each week. Sunday, I'm going to be making sure that I get to every single one of your comments. So please let us know what you're thinking and want us to cover in the future. That being said, my friends, I want to remind you all to hit our sub button if you have not done so already. We're looking to try and get ourselves to 2,000 subs as quickly as we can. And if we do, there's that reward for you. I'm going to put myself on the challenge of having to, do some form of karaoke to reward you all for helping us hit our goals. So that being said, my friends, I hope you all have a great day out there. And as always, I hope you stay classy out there, my basic